So welcome all. I am Laura Diamond. I have been coordinating the lecture series this fall, working with Assistant Dean Killian Riano. We're looking at infrastructure and land this semester, and really thrilled to welcome Dash Marshall to Pratt, and also Farzam, who will be moderating. And I think part of what we were particularly, I really appreciated learning about their projects and also thinking about how they sort of expand the constraints of the discipline and think about what it means to be architects, to have a practice. From thinking about the way that we produce renderings as architects, but then also contribute to sort of remaking the city. Here I'm thinking of New York City with the eating spaces in Koreatown built during the pandemic, and also the newsstand project. And so but then also, like, I loved learning about House for Grandparents. And so really, you know, Dash Marshall working across scales this is something I talked about with Farzam earlier in the day, but really thinking about sort of the movements that people have throughout the day and how this intersects with space. And also about a sort of like joyous way of relating to architecture. And so I am really looking forward to learning more about the practice tonight. And I'll pass along to Farzam. And thank you so much to Dash Marshall.
Thank you, Laura. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Pratt Institute and another yet again exciting event as part of our fall 2021 lecture series, which we're proud to be hosting this evening. My name is Farzam, a member of the faculty at Pratt Institute School of Architecture, and I'm pleased to be serving as your moderator tonight. I'd like to take a moment and extend my most sincere gratitude to all attendees and encourage you to also attend the future and upcoming wonderfully organized and orchestrated lecture series by my dear colleagues, Professor Laura Diamond and Assistant Dean Killian Riano, in collaboration with our student leaders from the Pratt Futures group, most notably Mr. Jared Rice, who has been instrumental in successful planning of all these events, You can find details surrounding these events on architecture.pratt.edu and on Pratt SoA Instagram. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Amy Yang, Ritchie Yaol, and Bryan Boyer, representing Dash Marshall and the esteemed co-founders of this multifaceted, multidisciplinary architecture and strategic design practice based here in Brooklyn and Detroit. My favorite of the trio, only because we share the same alma mater. Amy Yang holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, respectively. At Columbia GSAPP, she was the recipient of the William Kinney Fellow Traveling Prize in Architecture. Ritchie Yaol and Bryan Boyer hold undergraduate degrees from the University of Waterloo and Rhode Island School of Design, respectively, and both hold graduate degrees from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Ritchie Yaol is a design critic at Harvard Graduate School of Design and gained notable experience at prestigious offices such as Office of Metropolitan Architecture and David Adjaye Associates. Bryan, a published author, runs Dash Marshall's Civic Studio practice with a focus on technology, urban environments, and institutions. He was previously a founding member of the Helsinki Design Lab at the Finnish Innovation Fund. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Amy, Bryan, and Ritchie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, Farzam, Killian, and the whole Pratt family for having us. We're really happy to share some of our projects and look forward to the discussion. So with that, I'm going to share the screen and we'll jump into it. So you heard already, Dash Marshall is a architecture and strategic design studio between Detroit and Brooklyn. We work at many scales, from details that feel just right in the hand to the perfect place to read a book, to the sequence of an experience through space. how buildings sit in the city, and also strategy for big questions like how autonomous vehicles will change the landscape. We start with human ritual, like spending time with family, and we design out from there in all of our projects. So function is really important to us, but so is creating the right atmosphere or mood. We're obsessed with tectonics, and in fact, we call it the matter battle, the fight to bring things together in an elegant way. But we're not afraid to laugh at ourselves, or at least we'd like to think that we're not afraid to laugh at ourselves and have a good time while doing it. So none of our projects look the same, and that's intentional. The aesthetic from each of the projects develops because it's part of creating the right affect or mood, the right milieu for the project and for the people who are part of it. So every project is different. And from the 10 years or so that we've been running the practice, you see on the screen a mix of architecture in a very classic sense, all the way to strategic design projects for policymakers and others. And we're going to show a sampling of that work today. So we'll start with the view stand, which was a project that we did for a competition in New York called Care for Hudson Square. And the prompt was to provide a public space intervention in the Hudson Square neighborhood. And this was last year at a moment when, as I'm sure you visibly remember, the streets were empty of people on the one hand, and yet they were full in a totally new way with the voices of resistance against police brutality and really calling very important and strong attention to the civil rights issues that had been ignored for too long. And we wanted to reconnect one of the oldest and most essential feedback loops in the context of public space through this project. So for the Hudson Square initiative, for those of you who aren't familiar with Hudson Square as a neighborhood, it's basically west of Soho. We were looking at the area where the red dot is, which is Spring Street Park, and had the possibility to propose an intervention essentially in the right of way, right? So in a parking spot or potentially, well, actually, we stretched the rules and proposed some alternatives that you see in the dotted red lines, but we were really supposed to propose something that would sit in the right of way itself, and that meant designing to a certain set of constraints. The view stand is a newsstand. It's also street furniture, and it's a system, and that system is meant to occupy a space that's larger than its physical footprint. And the way that we do that is by proposing the view stand as a place that publishes a newspaper that collects the voices of people and replays them or feeds them back into that place. And what we're hoping to do through this project is create kind of virtuous cycle of communication at a time when most of us were stuck in our houses without much face-to-face contact, furiously scrolling through Instagram or through social media. We wanted to find a way to bring people back into physical space. And so the feedback loop here is a really critical thing for us. And what it does is the view stand collects the views of the neighborhood and plays them back to itself. And so you see on the right-hand side of the screen a mock-up of the newspaper that the view stand creates. And essentially views are taken in the form of people taking away newspapers from the newsstand in the way that you would in a traditional newsstand, getting the New York Times or whatever. But views are also given. So one side of what we call the taco in our office is a place for you to grab a newspaper and go. And the other side is a place for you to give your response or your view on a set of themes that we were curating for a weekly basis while the view stand was proposed to be in operation. So it's a very simple project, as I mentioned, because it sits in public space. We're really trying to design within the constraints of that realm, if you will. It's an A-frame with various levels of cladding. And what it produces then is a place to store the seats and tables that you see in the evenings. But when it's busy during the day, we basically fill up the surfaces of the view stand with material, with paper, right? And again, those are collecting the ideas and views of folks responding to themes around topics like joy or mourning or democracy, really kind of potent questions of the day. and that as the day goes by and people are taking the newspapers away, it kind of disappears. And so the taco is meant to dematerialize as people are engaging with it over time. And then on the backside, you see, again, a view of the kind of input, if you will, for the view stand. And the idea is that, you know, here, I think what we're questioning in a way is what is the extent of emotional force that a piece of architecture can bring to us as a community? What can architecture do, and what do we have to supplement with other mechanisms like activities? Something that's even going beyond program, for instance, because when we talk about program in architecture, it's often a kind of inert thing that happens in a space, right? Or something that's been curated in advance and is very determined and known. But that's not what we wanted to create here. We wanted to create a space for the unknown, the kind of emergent activities of the folks in the Hudson Square neighborhood and anybody who was coming to the site. And so in this sense, what we tried to design the project as is a kind of infrastructure, to use the theme of the evening, an infrastructure for communication at a neighborhood level.
So Made in Korea was an outdoor dining concept brought to us by a previous client that we had. The site is actually located in Koreatown in New York City, which is predominantly 32nd Street between Madison and Broadway, although it trickles north and south. A few businesses do. The site was an empty lot of demolition debris. It really is a microcosm of what the pandemic had done to the city. The developer had planned to build a condo, but put his project on hold indefinitely. So with a lot of collaboration between Dash Marshall and our client, we kind of talked about different ways and what kind of program we could really develop and look at how we can help the Korean community and help businesses that were struggling there, and also to uplift the Asian community. Koreatown has a unique typology because there's so many businesses that are multi-level. There are restaurants, bars, karaoke spaces, my favorite, and other businesses on the second floors and above. So we thought the site was exciting because it's an empty corner lot. It's almost like a gateway right into the heart of Koreatown. And we felt the space could serve the Korean community or Koreatown community as a whole. Through an app that our client developed, customers can order drinks from Made in Korea, but food from different restaurants in Koreatown. Runners will pick up your food and pick up your order and bring it to your table. And this allows our space to bring more business to the and street presence to restaurants that were located on the second floor and above. We designed two typologies for outdoor dining. First were street sheds. This is our version of the ones you see all over New York City. And then we also developed a modular system of pods to be used on the empty lot. And you can essentially array the pods and they will come together into outdoor dining hall. The structure is very simple. It's a basic construction, 2x6 wood structure, polycarbonate panels, corrugated metal sheets. All of this can be fabricated off-site and then assembled on-site. Assembled on-site. Idea for the roof was that we'd have high impact graphics to draw you in and play a role of signage right into K-Town. And the patterns also filter in light during the day and create views at night. The pod structure is also very simple, 2x6 wood structure, corrugated metal sheets, FRP fiberglass grating. We use fiberglass grating because it was one of the few materials that weren't too impacted by the supply chain, and it was actually readily available. It's a great material because it can be non-corrosive, it's lightweight, but it's structurally can be sound on its own. And what we actually appreciate about it the most is that it gave us privacy between the different pods without sacrificing air circulation, which is obviously very important at the time. And they have a lot of fun colors. So we actually originally wanted to do orange and blue for the Knicks, obviously very New York, but actually yellow was the one that was available at the time, and it actually worked out really great. And you can see that when we built it, you know, the colors really draw you in. But in general, the process wasn't, you know, as easy as we make it sound. There was actually a lot of negotiation with the council members and actually with expediters and how we approach what this project is. The zoning was residential, and so the city hadn't seen anything where we're trying to put in an outdoor dining gathering space, but in a residential zoned area, but it's also for temporary use. So ultimately, with a lot of discussion, a lot of collaboration with our client, we were given a temporary use permit, but basically you're allowed certain functions, but not others. And most importantly, what we felt sold the project to the council members was that our focus on showing how the project would help multiple businesses, not just the owner themselves, especially in the AAPI community. I think everybody knows that Asian hate has been a serious issue in New York at the start of the pandemic and until now. And we felt it was important that to use this project to highlight ways that we could support each other. Here's some more images that we're going to highlight for the sheds. Here you can see the circle cut out in the roof, and actually when you're inside the shed, it frames your view to the Empire State Building. And a few more photos showing the different shed designs. This is interior of one. Here's the exterior with the sliding fiberglass door. And then you can see the pods in the wild. And then you have a view to the entry. And really on a beautiful night, it's really a great environment to be in. If you love Drake, they play great music. If you don't, well, I'm sorry, I cannot help you. But more importantly, we're actually really excited that the Regional Plan Association is recognizing these structures. They hosted an award ceremony called Alfresco New York at Made in Korea. It was to celebrate the resilience of the city and the unique visions businesses had for their structures. And the city is now trying to develop more clear zoning and guidelines for these structures because they are becoming a more permanent part of the New York streetscape. So we hope you get to visit sometime.
Okay, so if we switch gears a little bit from projects that have a very clear kind of architectural and immediate spatial presence, we've also been working on a number of different strategic initiatives that are almost like before planning, if you will. So it's like before there's a concept, before there's even a brief, how do we figure out the way that we'll live with unknowns? For instance, the unknown of autonomous vehicles. There is so much hype about what autonomous vehicles could mean in cities. And yet, actually, most people, if we were together and I asked everybody to raise their hand if they've been in an autonomous vehicle, you know, in past experience, it's at most 10% of a group like this, right? It's still quite a rare thing to experience. And so what this asks us as designers, not just the Dash Marshall team, but I think all of us here together, is how do we start to grapple with these things? How do we prepare to design for them or design with them when they're almost unknowable in a certain way? So we've been working on this through a whole series of different projects that are really intended to give tools for designers, policymakers, community members, and others to imagine and to debate even what it's like to live with autonomous vehicles. One of the ways that we might frame the architect's work in this area is to imagine just today, what are all of the types of things that people are concerned about when it comes to mobility in cities. And so this is a very partial list, but it's a number of items here. And if we were to ask which of these are things that architects are currently working on, that list gets somewhat shorter. Maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3, but it's certainly not the whole list, right? There aren't many architects who are thinking about things like privacy and data policy, for instance. But in fact, those questions have as much to do with shaping the outcomes of what the city feels like in 20 years as thinking about the architecture, the facades that we put on the street, right? Another way to think about this would be to ask, if you see these 2 names, and we imagine we are all sitting with the mayor of every major city in America, and we ask, okay, all you mayors, raise your hand if you know what Uber is. Maybe 99% of them would raise their hands. Maybe it's only 95%. And then if we ask the same question of Olmsted, how many of you know who Frederick Law Olmsted is? what percentage do you think we would have raise their hands? Maybe 50, maybe 20, maybe 10. You could replace Olmsted's name here with almost any other famous architect or planner, and we would venture that the results would be somewhat similar. So this doesn't mean that planning and architecture are not important. It means that there are new kinds of agency in the world that we have to find a way to interface with or interact with. And so through our Civic Futures work, that's one of the things that we're trying to tackle. It's a kind of an era of transition, if you will, where we have choices that seem individual, like when you hail a car on Uber, that feels like a choice that you're making, but added up in the aggregate, it has systemic consequences, right? In a city like New York, the consequence is an increased level of congestion. That means slower transit times to hospitals, to schools, to other places. Whether or not you use Uber, or even if you don't have a cell phone, you're experiencing some of those effects. Likewise, technology like autonomous vehicles or delivery robots in the example on the screen can feel really cool and exciting, shiny, new, etc. When they're presented in the way that the technology companies often do, which is an image like this from an Estonian company called Starship. But are you ready for those same devices to turn your sidewalk into a highway? And is that something that you want to leave up to other people to make a decision about? Or do you as a designer want to be involved in shaping the way that these technologies come to be in our cities? And so for the past 5-6 years, we've been working on this through a number of different avenues, one of which is just simply doing the work of mapping current technology, what's out there, in what quantity, of what characteristics, and where is it located. So the left side of the screen is showing a project we did with the Star City group and a collaborator by the name of Anthony Townsend, who's been a frequent collaborator for us, looking at where in the world cities are doing piloting work for autonomous vehicles. We tracked 100 and some cities over the life of that project and presented each of them in a very straightforward website. Likewise, on the right side of the screen, you see some work that my students did at the University of Michigan, surveying the different types or species, if you will, of autonomous robots that are currently in production. So things you can buy now or things that you'll be able to buy soon, right? So that's, yes, of course, taxis and shuttles and cars, but also things like the burrito delivery robot that you saw previously, factory robots, things that carry logs around. There's a whole long tail of different devices. And the question we were asking as a group is, why can we open a copy of graphic standards and see the details of how you plan for a car, but not a delivery bot, right? So if we don't have that kind of basic detail, how can we hope to grapple with it as a material, as designers, to make it our own? And so the robot survey on the right is an attempt to do that. The Civic Futures projects we've been doing related to autonomous vehicles also involve a lot of co-design and collaborative exploration. So really getting people in the context of design workshops to kind of methodically think about how autonomy, how machine learning, how robotics, how these technologies might land in their neighborhood and what they might want to do with them, rather than just accepting what Uber or Ford or Tesla or whoever else is actually building for you. So instead, if we flip that and say, what do we want? It's a way of thinking about how we might domesticate these technologies for our own benefits as individuals and as communities. So we're doing work like this with designers, yes, architects, planners, yes, people from a digital background, yes, journalists and community members, a kind of wide variety of different folks. But we're also doing the same type of thing with policymakers. And so what you see in this image is a scene from a co-design workshop that we hosted with a network of mayors, directors of transportation, and other folks in city leadership from a network of 10 cities that Bloomberg Philanthropies put together. And this is connected to the atlas that I showed a few slides ago. And so what we're doing with the folks in this room is really helping them, again, express the ways in which they, as city leaders, could imagine using these technologies, not because the gentleman, framed here in the front is going to go build a robot, but because we want folks like him and his colleagues, all of the people in the scene, to be able to then think about the policies that they're writing before their sidewalk is turned into a robot highway, right? Because at that point, it's too late in time. And so we're trying to help people be more proactive by expanding the understanding that they have of things like autonomous vehicles. So a lot of the work that we do in this space kind of culminates in publications, perhaps unsurprisingly, because again, we're trying to help folks grapple with things that don't exist yet. So writing and drawing pictures are a really powerful way to do that. And this, for instance, is a newspaper of different speculative futures that we put together for the Mindaru Foundation, also with Star City Group, the same collaborators as before. And this is a screenshot of a website that we built for the National League of Cities and Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Aspen Institute, looking at autonomy in a range of different transportation devices. So again, yes, taxis and shuttles, but also buses and bikes and other things. And this is presented for a policymaking audience, but also a general audience, right? So we're often in the publications we're doing, we're really holding ourselves to a standard of kind of bringing things down to earth and making them accessible to the widest number of people possible. One of the ways that we do that is by designing scenarios, so showing what it might be like to use the kinds of things that the people in our workshops are imagining. And so, for instance, this is a snapshot from the website that I showed previously, looking at how autonomous shuttles in a city, let's say it's Detroit, for instance, might link together in a novel way. And it looks fairly typical, I think, but when you start to dig into the details, for instance, here we're proposing that a university shuttle, something like Wayne State, for instance, which is here in basically downtown Detroit, might link up with something like a company shuttle to form interlocking routes in a transit network. And that's not something that typically happens, right? Public transit and private transit tend to be totally separate systems. But the reason that we're making drawings like this and proposing ideas like this is to imagine how can we be really efficient with the way that these systems land in our cities. And if we can do that, is there a way in which we might think about some of the broader goals, like for instance, reducing the total number of vehicles on the road and therefore reducing the total amount of energy that's needed to power those vehicles. So in all of these projects, it's a little bit of a mix of the kind of things that you do as a designer, in particular here, human-centered design methodologies to understand what are the challenges that folks are facing, what are the kinds of solutions or responses that we might develop to them, and then using foresight, which is a set of methodologies to kind of imagine the world that grows around those ideas. And so ultimately, I think it's fair to say that the idea of design here is being stretched a good bit from the way that we think about it in architecture school. But maybe we could offer a reframing of what you do as designers. The work of design is to go from an infinite number of possibilities to the one thing that you build, right? You as a designer are shepherding that process of deciding what's the one version of this house that we're going to build for you as a family, for instance. And often the way in which designers enter the work in a kind of traditional design setting, it's really about answers. So when somebody comes to us and says, we want a house, we want it to be on the waterfront, they already have lots of details figured out. They know how many bedrooms they want. They know what they're into, what they like stylistically or not. And they're looking for us to develop a set of answers for them. And if we allow ourselves to imagine moving upstream, moving back in time, there's a whole different conversation to be had around what are the questions that we need to be asking, right? Why does this thing exist? Why do you want to build a house? What do you need that house to do for you? Is it something that you need functionally for your family to create a roof over your head? Or is it more about aspirations or some deeper meaning? And so that is a kind of metaphor for the work that we do in the Civic Futures projects, where we're really partnering with philanthropies or occasionally with companies and helping them ask strategic questions about what they want to do in the world. So the design is a kind of illustration or a spark in that context, but it's not about the, super refined details of something that you're going to go build immediately after the project's over. So perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion, but for now, we'll jump quickly to People Party.
So changing gears to our People Party app, we were looking at doing some small side projects for us that would honestly just make our lives and our work easier. But ultimately, we realized this infrastructure is something very personal. And in the case of People Party, we built our own infrastructure because one, we wanted to accelerate and improve our work in the office. And we felt that it was really important to present images that reflect the cities they represent. Basically, how architects and designers populate our images is very insane from a labor perspective. You're cutting and cropping images in Photoshop, saving them as different types of files depending on the transparency you want. And so what we saw was basically everything being labor intensive. But at the same time, we also saw that there was a poor representation of people and their cities. Detroit is 80% Black, but the image is not. So we saw that there are different diverse libraries that help. They have their own images that you can save or purchase. And we realized it was very difficult basically at the cost of cognitive overload, that people had to think too much about how to populate their images. So our goal through this app was to simplify. All we had to say was, where's the image? What city are you in? And how many people does it need to feel like a party? And basically all of that information can be input into our app. The software uses census data to grow a population for the image. As more people are added, the demographics are maintained. Skin and hair colors are assigned from a spectrum. It's not a perfect representation to the full diversity of humanity, but nothing will be. It's more nuanced though than other tools that are available currently. And using census data has problems. Would a library in Billings, Montana really want to represent itself as mostly white? I think these are questions that we all need to ask ourselves. This led us to realize we need to build in tools for the user to move beyond the strict adherence to the data. A future version of our app will have a utopian mode that provides more of a diverse population for places that are homogeneous. And People Party, it focuses on the population. It means we don't want you to worry about the individual colors of each shirt, pants, and everything else. We use palettes for the overall population, and the color palette is applied to the population. You can randomize quickly, and you can easily test it out. And you can change the palettes or make your own. So, we had a number of preset palettes that we developed and will continue to add to the app. But, we had a lot of fun with the color themes. We have Porahe, which is obviously related to BTS, and Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. Smashing Pumpkins happens to be one of Ritchie's favorite bands, and the color palette of the Mexico Olympics, 1968. If you use a library of images, you have to create a crazy folder structure. You have to keep everything organized. So instead of having to do that, we use the search engine, and you basically are doing a keyword search. If you want people who are running instead of standing, old instead of young, wearing coats instead of shorts, it's very easy to find on our app. And you can randomize the positions of the people on the scenes as well. As you can see, you can just grab and go as you need to, or grab and move. We've actually used a tool now internally in almost most of our renderings, or all of our renderings. And we've actually allowed students to test the app themselves, and a lot of them are using it too. And it's really cool to see. We had a lot of students send us different images that they created. So if you're ever interested in using the app, you can sign up at peopleparty.app, and all you need is an edu email address, and we'll send you an invite to use it. So we just want to say thank you to Pratt and for having us tonight. One thing we wanted to really mention was that we think architecture, design, and strategic planning is a collaboration. we wouldn't have our projects and they wouldn't be what they are without our team. So together, that's what makes Dash Marshall. So we just wanted to say thanks to our team as well.
Thank you, Amy, Brian, and Ritchie. Outstanding manifestation of the wide-ranging work that Dash Marshall's producing. Your well-established practice has definitely made successful attempts at contributing to the project of rescuing architecture from its mediocrity and banality. I would like to underscore the intrinsic value in the work that you're doing, which is an emphatic and genuine commitment to improving lives. In the case of Dash Marshall, of course, it's apparent that we do not need a building to necessarily engage in the cultural project to create specific, inclusive, yet personal experiences. I do not want to take too much space and time tonight. I've had a lot of great questions that came in through our student groups. Our wonderful students have sent a lot of good questions. And since we're on the subject of People Party, I would like to use this opportunity to read some of these questions to you, if that's okay. And I think if Laura and Killian are okay with that, we can switch it up a bit and go to the audience here. So
that sounds
one of the questions.
Oh, sorry. Should we move out of sharing screen mode? We can just go back to the. Yeah, that's great.
So one of the questions that came in, People Party begins to ground projects in what is realistic now, ensuring BIPOC spaces are not whitewashed. Can representation and visualization have a voice towards breaking down and achieving more inclusion and equality for the future? What are your thoughts on it being a prospective tool?
The difficulty of being in 3 different places is we don't know who's going to answer the question first. Let's make Ritchie answer it.
I don't think it's the final tool. I think it's a start. Obviously there's multi-layers to sort of the system that we need to address and change. Architecture is a lot deeper than representation, but on the surface, between like non-architects and architects themselves, this is the first tool that we do see, right? Renderings of buildings. So I think it's a very important start to accurately have renderings represent the demographics of cities and places, but obviously it's not the end all.
One thing I want to add to that is also it's not that hard to do. So why wouldn't it have been done sooner? I mean, it's not that hard to diversify renderings and add people of different colors to those images. So why shouldn't we do it? It almost should just be a normal, and it shouldn't be something that we're even talking about or questioning, but we are.
I think in terms of the question about being projective with it, Amy hinted at that in the discussion about the library and Billings as a kind of hypothetical example. There are some cases where using the exact representation of the world today just isn't going to match the aspirations of a place or a particular project. It's not going to match what you're trying to communicate. And so, I think the higher level point of People Party is that it should be easier to express your intent, right? Whether your intent is a baseline of some kind of representative accuracy, or if your intent is to go beyond that in a specific way. But it shouldn't rely on you doing lots and lots of Google searching and like cutting and pasting. We should be able to find ways to accelerate that process for us, and like Autodesk and Adobe aren't going to do it for us.
Thank you. Another question, and we have some questions in the chat as well. A question that came in from our wonderful students. I dislike the compulsion to ask BIPOC designers and firms how being BIPOC affects their practice. To flip that question, what ways do you find being a BIPOC firm empowering? What are some of the more beautiful moments that have come from it?
I find camaraderie in being a BIPOC office with just other firms or even clients. I think that type of community is inherent. That's just a Koreatown project is one good example where we've developed a very close relationship to our client. And actually that project came up because we did a different project for him and he couldn't build it because of the pandemic and he lost funding. So he said, all right, I have some funding, I have much less money now. What can I do with this? And how can I help my own community, with whether it's the restaurant industry or the Koreatown community? But I think for me, it's a lot about, there's a natural ease to camaraderie that develops amongst fellow BIPOC firms or friends or collaborators.
Thank you, Amy. Emily in the chat, how is brainstorming different for such a broad project like automatic vehicles? How do you decide where to start?
Mostly it causes more brain pain. I mean, I think those projects, they have a kind of infinite possibility to them, right? So going back to the diagram of on the one side infinity, on the other side one, you can't get to that like one output by making baby steps. You have to just kind of jump in and find a place to start. And so the way that we've done it in a number of the workshops and different things related to the autonomous vehicles work that you saw, part of it is informed by what's going on in the world. That's why it's important for us to be doing the research to understand what's actually out there. How are people using autonomous vehicles right now? Is it mostly for able-bodied folks who can get somewhere a little bit faster, or is it creating access to mobility for folks that maybe have a different starting point, right? Like wheelchair users or others that rely on things like paratransit. And so in those projects, often what we begin with is a set of needs, and we like to be as thoughtful as we can, or very thoughtful, I guess is a better way to say it, more forcefully, about the types of different people that we're centering in those equations. And so sometimes there's a real place and there's a real community, and you can work with that directly. Sometimes there's not. And so we have to take a stab at understanding who are the types of folks and the types of experiences that they have that are often marginalized, and how do we bring those back into the center, not just because it's the right thing to do from a representative standpoint, right? That is true, but it's also often it's a harder starting point and a more idea generating starting point, right? So if you take on the design of a mobility system for a wheelchair user, if you address that, if you figure it out, you're going to also create something that works for people who don't use wheelchairs. But if you do it the other way around, you start with somebody who's able-bodied, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be appropriate for folks who use mobility aids like a wheelchair. And so it's really about being conscious of the starting point so that those don't create traps or create kind of exclusionary mechanisms later in your process as a designer.
Thank you, Bryan. I have a lot of great questions that came from the students. I'm just enjoying reading them, frankly. How does working with nonprofit collaborators on designs differ from other clients and collaborators?
I don't think it's, I mean, this is my opinion. I don't think it's very different. I think the challenges to working with a nonprofit and a client that is completely separate is very similar. Architecture sort of is part of a bigger world of like where constraints of budget, site, environmental, it takes place. It depends. It doesn't matter which kind of client you have. The similar kind of agencies that affect the project is very similar. That's my answer on the surface. Amy, Bryan probably would have a different thought about it.
I mean, from the business side, obviously, when you're working with a nonprofit, you're not going to make as much money as you are, or none at all, And that's okay. I think that the most important thing is time management and project management, and just understanding deliverables and goals, because I think if you can manage the time properly for nonprofit type work, it can be very rewarding, but you also have to be very realistic that you can only put so much time into certain projects if it's not bringing in a certain amount of income to keep, frankly, your business running. And I think that's a huge thing that a lot of people learned actually over the pandemic, was when people were having more difficulty on the business side of it all, and frankly, just making money, what were people were trying to find other avenues and thinking about other ways to expand their businesses.
Thank you, Amy. Another question: how do you choose your projects as a relatively young practice in order to still work in areas you desire while staying surviving as a practicing firm? How do you find new projects, and what role does representation play in your like your publication, social media, graphic conventions play in your practice?
Who wants to start? I think that's a good question. As a young practice, we didn't really have the opportunity to kind of turn certain projects down, because obviously as like a practice that needs to pay for health insurance and salary, sometimes you just don't have the choice of choosing that perfect client, which is like an art gallery somewhere upstate in New York. We had to figure out a business model that on one hand, we had to take projects that pays for the salary, the rent, and then occasionally we would be lucky enough that we would get that perfect project, right? But as three nerdy architects, we wanted to challenge ourselves, and we made sure that with every project that we got, even though on the surface when it came in we would feel that maybe it just needed to be A to B, we would find ways to kind of like rethink whatever that typology was, whether it's a small pre-war apartment. If you go to our website, there's an early project that we did, which is a pre-war, and the client came to us with a very strong aesthetic, which is matching like some of the classical details that you have in the pre-war. But even in the minute details of how we interpreted the molding, was where we found internally for us a way to challenge ourselves architecturally and to rethink something. But that's a very good question. I think in practice, the utopian idea is that you have these perfect clients that come, but when you're trying to balance the balance sheets, ultimately you don't have that luxury sometimes.
Thank you, Ritchie. The next question comes from Professor Laura Diamond.
Thank you. So I thank you so much for your lecture tonight, and also I think it's really fascinating to hear all of your thoughts, responses about what it takes to run a practice, and just thinking about the sort of projects you take on and whatnot. So one thing that I was wondering, I feel like in our discipline, we somehow haven't yet really, I don't know, theorized or started to fully respond to the fact that we are, living with this airborne virus. And I really appreciated seeing your projects that you are, really thinking about how we remake space, how we shift as designers in response to the pandemic, but finding ways, to safely gather and, finding ways to respond through design. And so I wondered if you maybe just wanted to speak a little bit just about like how you started to, respond to the pandemic, and the ways that you know, and also with the newsstand project as like these spaces of reflection, or potentially as mourning, as you wrote about on your website. But also certainly the Made in Korea project, just how you sort of collectively, you know, started thinking about design as a response to the pandemic, and if it was something that maybe took some time to start to sort of see where it was going, or immediately you felt like, you know, how do we use you know, our tools as designers to respond. But yeah, curious about that.
I think that it's a question that we're continually asking ourselves, actually. I mean, I think we're still figuring things out, but at least in terms of, we were given some interesting opportunities with both the View Stand project and for the Made in Korea project, because it actually gave us a client that actually had a program, or even if View Stand, we developed the program, they came with an objective to us. And so it allowed us to focus our study and our design and our energies on very specific solutions to their needs. So for example, View Stand was just about how do we bring community together without like always physically having to be together. That's at least one of the aspects of View Stand. And then for Koreatown, it was, you know, it's not like a complicated program. It's just an outdoor eatery, but just the simple basics of creating privacy without sacrificing circulation, air circulation, using the FRP panels. So at least for those projects, what I found great is that we had a direct goal. I think right now moving forward, frankly, I think we're still trying to figure out whether it's from the types of projects you work on that can help highlight whether it's needs of different communities or needs of different people, or the type of clients you work with can create focus for how to address or bring to light the different issues because of the pandemic. I think all of those things we're still doing that I hope we're continuing to learn from. I mean, I think that's like a very small or short answer to your question. I think, I don't know if Ritchie and Bryan would like to add some more.
Yeah, with the Made in Korea, one thing that we wanted when we were sort of charretting with our client, the idea was fairly straightforward, right? We wanted to create a public kind of gathering outdoor space for the entire neighborhood. And one of the key things was sort of integrating the technology. You know, one of the early questions was if we had, like, what ordering system would we use and how would we make it efficient where, you know, like if a restaurant was half a block away, how would they know? So this, during the pandemic, I'm sure if you remember the early days, the QR code started showing up. And that was the key to kind of like unlocking the whole network in bringing that on an urban scale, not just thinking about it as a small restaurant, but if that QR code system was spread throughout the entire block, you could start ordering meals from 2 blocks away or 1 block away. And that allowed our space to be larger than the actual site itself. So I think it's key during the pandemic. You know, a lot of things are changing, but kind of like taking advantage of technology, thinking about it on an urban scale, how it can be applied, you know, outside just like the small 5-table restaurant that it was being used before.
And actually, just to add to what Richie's saying, just continually asking ourselves questions so that we can understand how to materialize these ideas into actual physical objects and materials and things. That's something that, you know, continue to do, whether it's through technology or even studying new products that are coming out. There's like, we had looked at for the View Stand, like coatings for metal and other surfaces that are more antibacterial, or even natural surfaces such as slate that are more antibacterial than, which is different from a virus, but just looking at actual intrinsic properties of materials, but also as new technology comes out. So I think the most important thing is to always continue researching and studying and learning these. Like you can't. I mean, there's no end to it, and there's always something new coming out.
I just want to add, I had some microphone issues, so sorry for the delay, but I think this actually isn't something that Amy and Ritchie and I have had a bunch of time to talk about. So maybe this will be a disagreement between the three of us. But I think a lot about the work that an architect does and the work that a person does. And everybody on this call is both of those. So, I think we're now exiting or somewhere in the middle of an exit of the phase where we just need people to cope in a very immediate way with a dramatic change to our shared life, right? So like the first round of street sheds were literally just sheds, like just get us outdoors, get us to somewhere where we feel safer. And the work that's happening now, and I think the View Stand and Made in Korea are both versions of that for us as a team, is not about coping, but about living with grace. How do we live gracefully amid a new context? And there's nothing that we as architects can do to change that public health context, right? That's something that we as people, as individuals can do. Advocating for vaccines, taking care of our loved ones, working for policy change, voting for policy change, for instance. And so the architectural questions here, I think, are about how we adapt to a new context and how we do it in a manner that doesn't feel like it's constantly coping. Right? Like the last thing that we want is to still be coping with this situation in another year or 2 years or a decade. And so the work that we're trying to do through these projects is to say, sure, the world is different, but how do we create a kind of calm, a happiness, a grace in that difference?
Thank you, Brian, Amy, and Ritchie. The next question comes from Assistant Dean Killian Rihanna.
Hey guys, thank you so much for the presentation. Incredible work. One thing that I wanted to talk to you about, I followed you on Instagram for a while, and during the pandemic, it's another pandemic related, but the other crisis that was highlighted and exacerbated, shown more immediate during the pandemic, the social justice crisis. And one thing that I noticed from your practice is a lot of posting on issues of Indigenous rights, of land back, and we started the semester. The first lecture was with the Lenape Center. So these questions have been a little bit of a constant. And being that this seems to be very important for your practice, and reading a little bit on the Instagram post why you're talking about these things, I wonder if you would share with us a little bit of why you as a practice decided to post those things and those questions that bring up.
Yeah, I think as a practice, it was like when these posts occurred, it was obviously during the summer of 2020. It was a very raw moment for a lot of us. For me, myself, I'm Canadian and I grew up in Canada. So a lot of the posts that dealt with sort of the Indigenous rights was something that I think for me growing in Canada was very important to kind of express and make sure that the voice was there, that we're giving support to the Indigenous people. And, we obviously don't have projects that currently at this stage that allows us to really affect some of the systematic issues that is deep within Canada's like the suppression of Indigenous rights, and we can go into the school boards. But it was just like a way of supporting as a BIPOC community and showing our support. And a lot of the conversation that we had internally, became projects like People Party, sort of like minute versions of what we can do as architects. Ultimately, I think in architecture, we tend to think that we could solve a lot more than we can. There's tends to be like overreaching, but I think our stance is more like brick by brick. What are like the micro scales that we can sort of change that is more tangible? That's my version.
I just wanted to add to what Ritchie was saying was something on social media that we felt was important was just about being vocal, where we're not saying that that's the only way to show a certain type of voice or support, but for us, that was our way. And actually, even if there's lots of internal conversations we have as human beings, just as friends, I think everything that kind of happened gave us and other people a lot more courage to speak up, and gave people much more of a open platform where other people were listening. And so I think at least Dash Marshall tried to take advantage of that, knowing that, you know, we could express certain feelings and emotions without, and basically have the courage to do that.
Thank you, Amy. What are different ways, the question that came to our student groups, what are different ways to design for the life cycle of a building? What can you do before versus through retrofit, and what can be done to bridge these two? Can you design for a potential retrofit later?
Sure. That's the short answer. Yeah, I think the conversation that's happening about deconstruction right now within the architectural community is, you know, it's a similar one, right? So it's very different from, but in my opinion, on the same order of magnitude as the civil rights conversation. We have a planet that is dying in the same way that our democracy is dying. And it's extremely, extremely difficult as architects to push against that. You know, so even designing the most energy efficient building comes with a ton of embodied carbon. So one of the most effective ways that we can push against it is by making the most of the buildings that we already have. And, you know, I don't think we can claim any particular intentionality here that our practice has been largely renovations to date, but that is the reality of our work, partially just by the accident that we started in New York. But, you know, for instance, here in Detroit, we're working on a theater for a group called Detroit Public Theater, a nonprofit theater company. And they were exploring different sites around the city, both in adaptive reuse locations and also greenfield new construction. And in those conversations, we joined with them and went to various different buildings and had conversations about what you could do there, right? And so I think one of the ways in which we kind of answer this question in a very tiny aspect is to help people imagine what's possible in the spaces that they visit, right? And to imagine the space of, for instance, a auto garage from the early 1900s and how you might convert that into a theater that will be the theater space of your dreams, even if the ceiling height isn't exactly what you wanted it to be, which, you know, has been a big concern for the client on that particular project. So I think there's a role there of advocating for reuse, advocating for materials that have a lower carbon footprint, are more recyclable, are more given to deconstruction and reuse later. But as Ritchie put it before, you know, he was using the metaphor of us working brick by brick, but in this case, it's like literally brick by brick. It's material by material. It's design by design. Every decision that you make kind of can incline that way or incline against it. And so we try, but it's not something that we have the luxury of treating as a dogma, I guess is how I would put it.
Laura, you have a question?
Yeah, I was really excited to see the Detroit Public Theater project, and particularly around you know, this the question of retrofitting, or the role that I feel it hasn't yet fully played in our discipline. But I do also, I feel we're at a point in climate crisis where I feel like we do need to question like how many more ground up buildings do we need? I mean, that's sort of like a difficult question, I feel, just even asking right now. But one thing I just wondered is in thinking about, because you do have such a systems way of looking at, so many different projects, as I was saying earlier, across scales. And I was wondering just if you wanted to share like any thoughts that you have just about like our supply chains as architects, like how we might be able to integrate like more upcycling of materials, or not entirely relying on just like fabricating and using like new materials for projects. And so that's sort of like slightly different from retrofitting, but I wondered your thoughts around that question.
It's a good question. And we grapple with it a lot because in our practice, you'll notice from our website, we have something like the Detroit Public Library or Detroit Public Theater, which is retrofit of a old landmark building. And on the other hand, we have projects in New York, which are complete like gut renovations of luxury apartments. And then we have something in the middle, something like made in Korea. Every project we try to be very cognizant of sort of our impact in what we propose. So, for example, one thing that we collectively as an office mentioned in 2019, 2020 was that we want to stop using concrete. But I think, or propose anything. I think as architects, we sort of get really fascinated by the aesthetic of concrete, the minimalism around it. But ultimately, concrete is one of the worst materials that you could be using, especially if you think about it, that it's just being used as countertops, right? But the hard thing is the industry is so locked in. And this is where I hope that it's not a cop-out, but I feel like we're part of a system that is, for example, if a client is completely invested in a certain time schedule and they want certain things done by a certain time, some of the lead times that would be accrued by like more eco-friendly products is something that the client in a presentation is just hard to kind of have a conversation, because they're like, oh, it's going to take 4 months. Oh, it's like the building department isn't quite ready for it. We have a project that we were looking at CLT, for example, in Detroit. And at some CLT is quite common in Europe, but in most of America, the contractors aren't used to installing CLT. You don't have the GC that knows how to work with it, right? Like these panels are hoisted similar to concrete prefab panels. It's not like a stick frame 2x4 construction where, you build the wall on site. So I guess where I'm going at is the ecosystem that we exist still doesn't quite have the framework to accommodate some of these better products. And every avenue that we get, we try to bring those in, but it's difficult, and it's definitely a challenge. And I think as a industry, as a larger whole, we need to address it. But I think we do have the momentum now, especially with the climate crisis that is being brought up, and hopefully that there is a sense of trickling down as architects. If we start proposing it to the clients, and maybe we can convince 1 or 2 clients, it creates a demand for it. And when there's a demand, the industry will adapt to it and will start allowing it to be used more often, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Go ahead, Amy.
Just to expand in a very small way to what Ritchie was saying, we talk a lot about brick by brick. In one aspect of our projects, luxury renovation, it is what it is. It's a luxury condo, luxury residence renovation. But we talk to our clients about donating some of the appliances and materials if possible. I mean, obviously it's not realistic most of the time, but actually appliances have been donated. And so if we can find ways, even if it's in a very, very small scale, to be environmental in that aspect, we do try, but it's not easy, and there's definitely, as Richie's saying, the ecosystem doesn't actually help us. But I think there's small things that we can all do to whether it's the type of materials used or just thinking a little bit more about where things go, where the materials and debris and demolition go.
Yeah, I think what Amy's pointing at is kind of us trying things, right? Both Amy and Ritchie talking about us trying to bring our values to the projects that we have. And that only works insofar as our partners, our clients, have the same values, or they can be convinced to adopt our set of values. And so I think, Laura, what your question gets at is the kind of structural limits of a service industry, which is what architecture is. We are consultants, right? We are working at the request of somebody who has brought a problem to our table. And so the most important thing then is for our values and their values to be aligned, right? So that we're not pushing uphill to try to say, hey, you should care about who the vendors are. You should care about what the materials are. You should care about the choices that you're making beyond just what's cheapest. And in a perverse way, I actually think if architecture were much more expensive, we would have easier conversations here. It's almost too cheap to renovate. And so we get into conversations in a lot of projects where we're VEing things down to the last dollar because people are trying to squeeze in a bunch of desires that they have, and it's perfectly acceptable for them to have those desires about their countertop or their appliances or whatever it is. But if the projects that we were working on were actually fundamentally more expensive, they all had another zero on them, we'd be a lot more careful about the decisions that we're making, and we'd be a lot more, I think, selective about the types of things that we're engaging in, because it wouldn't be a race to the last dollar or the last few cents. So I see this as something that's bigger than any one architecture studio and really bigger than architecture as a profession. I think it speaks to ultimately the limits of the profession. And I think because of that, it's not a coincidence that then we see startups and other companies who are creating things like housing as a product, right? Where they own not just the design, but also the fabrication and the entire supply chain. And therefore they can have a say on every aspect of that supply chain, rather than, quote unquote, giving it away to clients because that's the nature of their business model.
Yeah, I think these are all, this all raises really fascinating questions and considerations, and also, where, you brought up democracy in your presentation. And of course, and this is not, when I asked a question, not to expect you as like a single practice to have to, have this figured out and figure out a financial model where this works and whatnot. But really that it does take, because all of us in our practices are thinking about these things and like how do we, think both within our discipline, but then also, democratically at a public level, have these, start to think about these questions. And I think also as we see, that supply chains are under such incredible duress right now and are really, just breaking down. So I don't know if that has also sort of impacted your practice and just the actual like difficulty of building right now.
Yeah, a lot of things are over budget. But yeah, definitely, you know, Made in Korea was a perfect example when we were building it. I think that's when one of the ships decided to kind of like tilt sideways at the Suez Canal. And then it was also moving into summer. So that's when lumber was at the most expensive, rate. So we needed to adapt the design. Kind of, you know, the FRP panel was something that wasn't there originally, but it was like an alternative that was readily available. And normally it's used as grates that you walk on like, you know, bridges or something like that, or over HVAC vents. But we needed to kind of adapt quickly and think of like different ways of using it with the same like function that the client originally had seen. Like for that, he wanted more like wooden panels. I think as architects, like, you know, we're kind of in like this undetermined time. Like we don't know if, you know, come winter, there's another variant that will kind of force us to be locked down. But sort of thinking quickly and being able to adapt, I think is I don't know if it's the solution, but it's definitely something that we need to kind of, it's a skill set that we need to have right now. And I think it actually creates for more exciting situations. You know, before the 2019, 2020, you know, the architecture world was a little bit more static. So I'm always up for things that destabilize it. I think this is a great opportunity for a lot of young architects to come up with new ideas, new systems that you know, someone hasn't thought of.
And just from the project managing and like client perspective, I think there's like three major things that are really important to, you know, partly answering your question is, one, Ritchie touched on was just adaptability and flexibility, being able to change ideas and not be so rigid. And then actually it's communication's really important for us. With everything going on, we constantly are communicating with our clients and any of our collaborators, because frankly, things at parts of the project change daily. So I think communicating was really important. And actually, most importantly for our clients, it's been managing expectations. There's actually a lot of delays for some of our projects in construction right now that we already knew were going to happen. So we just make sure we're communicating and managing the expectations about all these things that can happen. And I think that's a really big part of any type of architecture design or strategy project.
Thank you all. I think I reserve the right to ask the last question here. So the phenomenal work you do at Dash Marshall and the theoretical anxieties you may have as you navigate the many challenges and opportunities in your practice could be the result of the two radical pedagogies you experienced as graduate students. No pun intended here, Bryan and Ritchie. But I'm wondering if you could please touch upon the role the Academy has played in your practice, whether in your evolution as an architect or your engagement as a teacher, Ritchie. Specifically, I would like to ask if you could refer to specific instances in your educational history that contributed to who you are today and the work you're doing at Dash Marshall.
Oof, that's a loaded question. I can start. We went to Columbia, and I think for me, actually, I did architecture undergrad as well, but I didn't think the program was that great until honestly the new generation of professors came in. I was actually Yi Jin-yoon's first studio there my senior year at MIT, and she's the reason I chose to go into architecture, because I just loved her studio and just different ideas and the way she challenged us to think. And that's how I always see architecture school. And especially at Columbia, I think it was really about teaching you different ways to think. And what I loved about Columbia was actually a lot of my classmates went off and did different things, whether it was in film or fabrication or becoming a traditional architect. And I think that was really important to see come out from the school, is that architecture school isn't just about, it doesn't have to be linear, and it doesn't have to be actually stubborn in what people think is the traditional sense of architecture.
Bryan, you want to go first, or who represents the GSD?
Go for it.
No, you could go first.
Okay.
Cap it off.
Sorry, Farzan, what was the question?
Specifically, I'd like to ask if you could refer to instances in your educational history that contributed to who you are today and the work you're doing at Marshall.
Got it. Okay.
I need to add to that.
You know, I think for me, I have an ambivalent relationship to architecture. So I graduated architecture school in 2008 and took the summer for a residency. And by the time I was sending portfolios, the entire global financial system had collapsed and nobody was hiring any architects. So I never had the opportunity to work as an architect. I sent resumes to 5 different continents, got 0 responses. And I had to pay the rent. So I kind of crawled back to a professor who I had worked for at the GSD, Marco Steinberg. And he had asked me, actually like the day before graduation, he asked if I would go work for him in Finland at the Finnish Innovation Fund, doing strategic design instead of architecture. And I said, no, Marco, I'm going to go be a famous architect. I'm going to work in a cool studio in Switzerland. And, you know, it's nice knowing you. I'll see you at an alumni event. And, you know, then I found myself a few months later kind of crawling back and saying like, maybe I can help, please. And that became a really amazing opportunity for me because it gave me the view into what it's like to be on the other side of the table. So not the architect serving a client, but actually somebody who's commissioning the work of designers and really laying the groundwork or creating the infrastructure for designers to do what they do best in the most efficient way. And not just in terms of the built environment, but to think about how you pull design as an activity, as a way of creating knowledge and creating understanding and agency into other parts of everyday life, right? So into policy, into questions of technology, into the public realm. And for me, you know, that was an accident. I had Marco as my first studio instructor. I worked for him here and there because I needed to make some money, and he was a nice enough guy. And it radically and completely transformed my practice as a designer. And I would have never had that experience if I hadn't embraced it because of the financial crisis, right? So on the one hand, it's a story of I didn't have any other choice. But on the other side, it's I see it more as like the universe telling me I should really take a second look at that offer that came from Marco. And that's translated directly into the Civic Futures practice that we've built as part of Marshall. And I you know, I think it's just on a personal level been very fulfilling to be able to kind of be a bit lost, frankly, in a lot of different professional contexts, but always rooted in this idea that what we bring to the world is an understanding of how systems come together and the impacts they have in space and on human experience.
Yeah, I guess sort of piggybacking off Bryan's comment, I think, you know, we both studied at the GSD. You know, if you really look at like the core of who Marshall is, it's like a smaller version of the GSD. One thing great about the GSD, it's a large school. You know, there's different pedagogies can exist within it, and I think that's the beauty about the GSD. Obviously, there are sort of core pedagogies that gets projected in sort of like what the school wants to promote. But while you're at Harvard, under that one roof is you have the landscape team, you have the urban design, you have the MDes, and it really, that cross-pollination, I think, is what was kind of like set into our early on in our education was that it's okay to work in different like scales, that architecture isn't just like the big A architecture. And it's also the mentality of how you think. You know, obviously GSD being like sort of the Bauhaus form follows function. There's that underlying like system that everything comes from a concept, right? That everything should be defensible. So I think that's what I took out of the GSD, is that, you know, me, Bryan, and Amy, one thing that we always tell anyone who joins our office or anyone who's about to leave our office is that, you know, the best thing you can do is actually make friends outside architecture. And that's one thing that I think is great about the GSD, is that you can take classes at MIT, you can take classes in different universities within Boston. And a lot of our clients that we have are people from outside the field, right? So it's that larger umbrella that the GSD provided, that we didn't have like a tunnel vision coming out of the architecture school, which I think was beneficial. And that's why you see in Dash Marshall, we have civic projects, and then we have like apartment renovations on one scale.
I think also for the three of us coming together, this is maybe a little tangent from your actual question, but you talked about what specifically in school, is there like a specific incident? For me, it was undergrad, because, you know, it was a very, very challenging studio. And frankly, she made me cry a few times. I'm sure everyone's been there. You know, we all go through these like crazy emotional times in architecture school. But I think more than what happened in school is, even you almost find that out later on, that the three of us came together as Dash because we actually come from not just different backgrounds, but our strengths are all very different. And so that was really important for us, that when we came together to recognize each other's strengths, and actually it works so much better as a team and a collaboration than if you're trying to do this on your own. I actually think that's very, very difficult.
Thank you, Amy, Ritchie, and Bryan, for sharing with us these stories. I definitely had tears in architecture school, not until I came to Pratt as a teacher. Tears of joy when I saw great work from my students. Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to extend my most sincere gratitude to all three of you for representing the wonderful work at Dash Marshall. Very inspirational. We definitely look up to you, serving as role models for many of us, including myself. I owe a huge thanks to Laura and Killian for giving me the privilege to moderate this event. And last but not least, Jared, Rice, and our wonderful students for the wonderful questions they sent in. I encourage everyone to attend our future and upcoming events. And once again, Bryan, Ritchie, and Amy, I hope to stay in touch with you, and can't thank you enough for your generous time tonight. Thank you.